her testimony. For those of you who don't know, she's met on Priscilla Schreier and Joel Osteen. Yeah. And here she is today. Let's give her. She's our wonderful friend. Good afternoon. So great to be here with everyone today. Can you hear me from like this? Okay. I'm going to share a little bit of my testimony. I know many of you have heard it before, so thanks. I think it'll be a bit of a twist with the season that we're in. So I'm going to kind of share a bit of my testimony, how it actually, I didn't realize until I was really praying about it, like how impacted, I can't even think right now. I was really impacted by this season, going through the seasons of trauma that I experienced. So I pray that you all are encouraged by it, and Jesus, just thank you for this opportunity. So I'm from this area. I was born actually in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. I grew up in Fairfax. I lived in Herndon, Virginia. And so I'm an 80s kid, and my father was a pastor in the Fairfax area of a well-known church, actually too. And growing up, I had a lot of just really great experiences, very unique experiences. And what I mean by that is my father had been incarcerated, and during that incarceration, he became a Christian. He was exposed to Billy Graham and decided to accept Christ. So due to that, he was actually released about 7 years earlier than he was supposed to. And so thank you, Billy Graham, because I wouldn't be here right now if that hadn't happened. The way the story's been told to me is a man by the name of Chuck Colson had recently been released from prison as well for Watergate. And he decided to start prison fellowship ministries. So he came to prison and met my father. And my father's a very charismatic individual. Like, he was networking before networking was a word. Like, knew how to move in a room and do all the things. So he was offered a job when he was released. And so when he was released, he started working for Chuck, and Chuck was a mentor to my father. They were very close. To me, he was Uncle Chuck. He was my godfather. I had no idea the enormity of that until I was probably around 18 or 19. I was talking to my friend, and it came up, and her mom was like, "What did she just say?" I'm like, "I don't know." So I didn't know anything different. So my father gets out. He meets my mom, and they marry within 3 months. Why would you do that? But they did. She said because he was fine. He was very handsome. So. But nonetheless, my dad had a lot of really amazing opportunities to help and do a lot of really great things that I won't take the time to get into. But he never dealt with his trauma. And so he was from Detroit. He came from a very broken home. He was physically abused in ways that I'll never know about. But instead of being able to deal with that trauma, he jumped into ministry. And I think it's a combination of the season of our society at that time. You didn't really talk about depression, especially, unfortunately, if you were a Black man. You're not going to talk about the weaknesses that you feel. And so, as time went on, over the years, there was a public life and a private life in our home. And so I can remember being maybe 5 or 6 years old, and it would be Sunday, and we'd be preparing for him to go preach, and I would get these migraine headaches because I knew I had to sit there, while all the while I'm thinking about the things that I've seen play out behind closed doors. What I mean by that is it was mostly verbal abuse for the most part up until the end, but it was just a very dualistic life. This is how you have to look at it when you're in front of all these people, but behind closed doors, just a lot of verbal abuse, mostly towards my mother. She was very passive, and it was hard. You just develop you're a child, so it's very confusing. So when I was 8 or 9 years old, we actually moved to New York. He was offered a position as the chaplain of a police department in Mount Vernon, New York, if anyone's familiar with Westchester. And so, all right, cool. Yeah, all right, so we lived there, and we were there for maybe 6 months, and it just went from bad to worse. And I think it was because he was separated from his support. And again, I'm seeing this through the eyes of a child. Now looking back, I believe that people were starting to put together the pieces of things weren't right, and my dad didn't want to have to deal with that. And so we moved, and by the end of that year, Christmas time, my mom had she couldn't deal, she didn't know what to do anymore. She was afraid for her life, just because of things that were happening, which I now know there were things that needed to be delivered. But she called the police. It was probably a couple weeks, I just remember Christmas lights and all the things were around, and they were the same police officers that my father was the chaplain going and praying for, right? So they come, we leave, we're gone for about 6 months, and during that time he did receive some therapy at a pastor's retreat. We come back, for 6 months things were fine, but they went back and actually became worse. And what ultimately ended up happening is that my mother left him for the final time, and 2 weeks later he hung himself and committed suicide. So I was 9 years old at the time, and we moved, my mother's from Virginia Beach, so we moved back to the Tidewater area, and quite honestly, I don't even recall mentioning his name, really, until I was about 19 years old. And it's kind of sad, I mean, obviously it's very sad when you think about it, but like, I had a really close core group of friends during my teen years, and 3 out of the 4 of us did not have fathers, and we never talked about it. So we knew each other for a decade. And I remember when I was like 18 or 19, I started talking about it, and they were like, that happened to you? I was like, yeah, like we just didn't talk about it. So when I think about Christmas and how that tied into those things, when I was a child, although there's a lot of pain in our home, my parents would like to compensate by buying gifts. And so as a child, you liked receiving gifts, you liked toys, you liked the lights, all the fun things. But as time went on, Christmas just became more and more painful. And then my dad died. And I really didn't like Christmas because every year I was reminded of what happened. Another aspect to that, and you actually reminded me of this, is we were talking over lunch, we were talking about like, clothing and what kind of clothing did you have as a kid, and like, did your parents buy you like nice clothes? And I was reminded, I was like, actually like, yeah, my mom bought me nice clothes, like too many things almost. And my grandmother did the same thing. And I think it was because of guilt. But then my senior year, I remember my mom, when my father died, we got this fairly large insurance payment, but my mom didn't know much about money management. And by the time I was a senior in high school, all the money was gone. And I remember it went from, I could basically do whatever I wanted, to we can't afford that, we can't afford that. So Christmas just became this thing that was more and more painful as the years went on. I didn't even touch on the fact that as a teenager after my father died, I became, I don't know if you want to call it a disaster, it depends on what you're talking about. Like, my life fell apart. I became promiscuous at a very young age. I became involved in drugs, alcohol, all the things. I was always able to make friends, but I always wore the mask, so people had to really get to know me to figure out if something was wrong. By the time I was 16, I'd been hospitalized 3 times for attempted suicide. I'd been told I was bipolar, ADD. There's like, I can't even remember anymore. Lots of diagnoses, lots of medications. And basically being told, or at least it was implied to me, that I would always be that way. Like, it wasn't ever presented as an option that you can heal, like it can be different. And I want to be respectful of time, so pay attention. Okay. So it was never, I didn't know anything. I was like, the idea of freedom, I don't think I heard that term until I was 28 years old. Somebody was like, we're praying and believing for your freedom. And I was like, what does that even mean? Because I didn't realize I was in bondage. And so when I graduated from high school, I ended up moving to Richmond, Virginia with some friends that were going to VCU, and they were, in sororities and doing all the things. So I kind of hopped into that lifestyle. I was always looking for something to distract me from the pain that was inside. It was like my soul was rotting. Like, that's really the only way I can describe it. Like, the pain, like, I look at pictures of me from back then, like, I don't even look like the same person. Like, my eyes just look dead. Around this time, I got involved with a drug dealer who was not only probably, I would say, a sociopath, that might be the accurate term. I pray that he knows Jesus today, but man, it was rough. I ended up getting pregnant, and I had 2 abortions in that relationship with him. And so all the guilt, all the shame from believing my father's suicide was my fault. I can't even intellectually tell you why I believed that, but I believed that to the pit and core of my being. All the rejection from the different relationships I've been in, plus just being a teenager, right? Like all the things that come along with that. So to add abortion to that and the shame and the guilt of that, I just remember I would have days where I couldn't get out of bed. Like physically I couldn't move. And during this time, I would say prior to this time, even a few years prior to that, I'd become involved with, I didn't even know it was the occult. I didn't know what that was called. I just knew that I wanted relief from my pain. I didn't believe Jesus could do that because people in church had hurt me. So I started searching out different books. There's a book called Conversations with God. Has anyone ever heard that book? That book does not mention Jesus at all. And I remember reading that book and thinking, where's Jesus? But I wasn't a Christian, but I was like, but I knew Jesus. Like I knew that Jesus, I believed that Jesus was God's son, but I wasn't following him. Like I did have that belief. And I remember thinking, like, they're not talking about Jesus, who are they talking to? And I still was searching in like Buddhism, and there's a book called, I won't even name the books, but it was just searching, and it was all like this workspace, like it was dependent on me. I must do these things. There's nothing about the release and dependence on Christ and what he's done for you. Like, does that make sense? So I was working at a bar, and I got fired. That was a theme too. I used to get fired a lot for having a bad attitude. And I came home, and somehow I ended up with TBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network, on my TV. And I smoked marijuana at the time. So the idea that the Christian Broadcasting Network was on my TV screen makes no sense to me, other than it was God. And there's 2 ministers, and if I said their names, you'd know who they were. But they offered for, if you want to accept the Lord, say this with me. And I did that. And I actually said, I remember thinking, why not? I don't know if I said it out loud, but it was enough where God took that. And I view that as when I chose to follow Jesus. So from that, the Lord slowly started to heal me. I started to attend church. There was a lot of miraculous things that took place, but I was still very broken, and I didn't know anything about deliverance. So it was like I would get to a certain point and I would fall back into depression. I would get to a certain point and I would fall back into anxiety. And I was like, what's going on? There's something wrong with me. And God, I love the people and the women. I'm so grateful for the women he put in my life. But it came to a point where they were like, I don't know. Like, they wanted to help me, but they didn't know how. And so around this time, I met my now husband, Paul, who he grew up in, for all intensive, comparatively speaking, a very normal family, Christian family. And he actually had made a list of the type of woman he wanted and prayed over it. And I found it. And one of the line items was someone he could help. So he met me, and he did not know that I came with all the things. And so over time, he came to figure out I came with all the things. And he was like, what is happening? Like, manipulation was my middle name. If you didn't do what I wanted, I knew how to like fall down and be like, I'll just kill myself. Like, that would be my thing. And he and I will speak sometimes, and he'll say, he's like, I was codependent. Like, he felt like it was his responsibility to prevent me from doing that. But God delivered him from that, because it got to the point where one night he was like, you know what? He couldn't deal with it. And so there was a whole drama, and that night I decided to, or I should say, that night I hadn't smoked marijuana in probably 4 years since I've been saved. But that night I knew if I called a certain person and I went to their house, I could do that. So I went to their house and I got high. The thing about it is, I used to get high all the time. And I mean, I could smoke and I wouldn't be affected by it. But that day, I don't even know, it was so little, but I was choking. And I was like, what is happening? And I ended up getting to this bathroom and I was like hugging a toilet, like choking, feeling like I was gonna die. And the Lord dropped into my spirit mercy. And what he meant by that was there is an organization called Mercy Multiplied that I had heard about probably 4 years prior that helps young women from the ages of now 13 to 32, free of charge with every life-controlling issue you can imagine. And now there's so many issues beyond what I dealt with 10 years ago. But they have over a 90% success rate, and that's an independent consulting firm. They don't take any government funding, so they have the power to preach about Christ. And the first time I heard about it, I decided not to attend. But that night, when the Lord said that one word, I knew what he meant, and I went and got on my friend's computer, and applied to the program. I was accepted, and it took a season of time, but I was accepted into that program, and I just was so desperate to have life in my eyes. I remember they had this catalog, and I would see these girls, and they had light in their eyes, and I didn't know what it was, but I was like, I want that. Whatever that is, like, I want that. And I remember the day I walked through the doors, I felt like this weight had fallen off my soul. And I didn't understand all of what was going on with me, but I had hope. And that's where I heard the term freedom for the first time. And I was there for 6 months. I lived at that home in St. Louis. They have 4 or 5 homes in the US now. And that was the first time in my life where not only did I feel completely accepted beyond all the things that I had done, it was the first time that it was actually explained to me, this is why we forgive. This is what the truth of God's word says. This is why it's important to know it. This is what generational curses are. This is what oppression is. And walking through and actually taking the time to explain it and to understand who Jesus is and what being righteous in Jesus means. Like the reality about that, like it's not works-based. I was a preacher's child, so I thought everything had earned, and viewing God as a father was very hard. And if I'm honest about it, it's something that I still struggle with today. It's something I have to constantly revisit and try to understand, like, it doesn't matter what I do. You love me. You accept me. It doesn't matter what I do. And so I got an opportunity to go through that program, and it changed my life completely. People who knew me then and know me now, when I came home and I graduated, they were like, what happened? Because not everybody understood where I went or knew where I went. And my now husband, we had broken up at the time, but I did see him towards the end, and he was just like I didn't have to say anything. You could see what Jesus had done. And so while I was there, I was actually there during Christmas. And that was the first time I had a Christmas where I could reflect back on that memory, and it healed so much. It healed so much. I was able to watch sitcoms from the 80s when I was a kid again because they didn't remind me of the pain of my past. Like I could enjoy them. Like little things like that. Like going and helping people. Like we had opportunities to go do things like that. And so, all of that happened. It was a wonderful experience. I graduated, I got married. Fast forward to today. Some of you that know me know this past year has been very hard. I lost my mother earlier this year. I don't know how many of you walked through fertility struggles. I have walked through that the past 2 years. And outside of the grace of God, I can't really give you an intellectual answer as to why Christmas doesn't make me sad. I think the time in the secret place helps. I was very angry this year. And God let me come to the end of myself in a lot of ways, trying to fix things. But in the midst of that, He showed me His love in ways that I don't know if I would have seen it otherwise. So, with all of that, if anybody can relate to any of that, I just want to encourage you that no matter what you've done, no matter what's happened to you, Jesus can heal it.
Right. So precious, isn't that so precious? I'm just, oh.